Isabel in the Pines. The wind whispered through the pine trees of Bitterroot Valley, Montana, carrying with it the scent of distant snow and the soft rustle of secrets. Isabel Hartley adjusted the strap on her field pack and stepped deeper into the forest, the cool air brushing against her cheeks like a cautious greeting. At 29, Isabel had grown into solitude, like some people grow into their skin, naturally quietly, and with a touch of melancholy. Her slight frame moved easily among the fallen needles and underbrush. Chestnut brown waves spilled from beneath her wool cap, and a pair of square-framed glasses clung to her face like an old friend. She wasn't beautiful in the obvious way, but there was something compelling in her gaze, something that said she listened more than she spoke and noticed what others missed. She had inherited her father's eyes and his cabin. Paul Hartley, a beloved forest ranger who had patrolled these woods for over 30 years, had passed away the previous spring. The loss left her adrift, not in rage or rebellion, but in a quiet ache that made the silence of the forest feel both comforting and oppressive. Her work as a wildlife biologist helped, at least on the surface. She told herself it was purpose, but really it was ritual, routine, something to fill the hours between dreams of the past and doubts about the future. Her small field cabin sat just over 3 miles from the nearest gravel road, nestled near an icy creek and surrounded by dense evergreens. It was modest. Wood stove, single bed, research station with a radio that crackled more often than it worked. No internet, no cell service, just her notebook, and the occasional visit from Ranger, her loyal border collie, who trotted beside her now, his black and white fur fluffed from the chill. She came here each fall to monitor wildlife activity, log signs of migration, and track predators through camera traps. Today, though, she hadn't planned to go far. A storm system was due to roll in by nightfall. Still, something had pulled her outside this morning. Not duty. Something else. An itch behind the thoughts. A sense that today wouldn't follow the script. About an hour into her hike, she paused at a ridgeline, adjusting her binoculars and scanning the tree line below. Nothing but pine and the quiet hum of the wind. She turned to Ranger. "Let's head back," she murmured. But Ranger didn't move. He stood rigid, one paw lifted, nose pointed downslope. His ears were perked in a way Isabel knew meant only one thing. Something was out there. She followed his line of sight. That's when she saw it. A shape moved between the trees, low and quick, then paused, perfectly still. It was a Bobcat Kitten, tiny, maybe 3 months old. Tawny fur flecked with darker spots, a signature white underside, and short, stubby tail. It shouldn't have been here. Not this close to a human. Not this curious. Isabel blinked. The kitten stared back, then turned, and began to walk. Not away, but into the forest, pausing, as if waiting to see if she would follow. And against all reason, all caution, she did. The kitten with no fear. The kitten's movements were oddly deliberate, not skittish like most wild animals. Isabel had seen bobcats before, adults mostly. Solitary, territorial, fierce. But this one was different. Young, for sure. Barely the size of a house cat. Its ears were tufted and upright, its legs too big for its body, and its paws crunched delicately over the frosted earth with a soft, padded confidence. And it kept looking back, almost as if it wanted her to follow. Isabel hesitated. Logic told her to observe from a distance, note its location, and move on. But instinct pulled her forward. Something about the kitten's behavior was too strange to ignore. This wasn't aimless wandering. It was purposeful. "Ranger," she said gently, placing a hand on his back. "Stay close." Together, they followed the kitten down a narrow game trail, past brittle brush, and under low-hanging pine boughs, dusted in early snow. The forest grew denser, quieter. Even the birds seemed to hush their chatter, as if the woods were holding its breath. 10 minutes in, the terrain began to change. The path dipped sharply, leading them into a shallow ravine carved by an old stream bed. Rocks, slick with frost, lined the descent. Isabel crouched slightly to balance, her boots crunching softly behind the kitten's lighter steps. She was about to call out, to try and shoo it off for its own safety, when it suddenly stopped at the edge of a small clearing. That's when she saw the trap. Steel, rusted, half covered in fallen leaves. Its jaws were clenched shut around the leg of an adult bobcat. Her breath caught. The larger cat was lying on its side, sides heaving slowly, the muscles in its back legs twitching with effort. The trap had snapped shut high on the limb, cruel, unrelenting. Blood soaked the ground beneath it, staining the snow pink. Yet the animal hadn't tried to flee. When Isabel approached, it barely lifted its head. The kitten trotted up to the adult's side, mewling softly. Its mother. Isabel dropped to her knees, heart pounding, already unzipping her pack. She always carried a trauma kit, field shears, antiseptic, but she'd never used them on a wildcat before. This was different. This wasn't part of the plan. The adult bobcat's amber eyes locked with hers, eyes that flickered between pain and something else. Trust, maybe, or desperation, Isabel whispered to calm her own nerves. "It's okay, girl. I'm not here to hurt you. I'm going to help if you let me." She slipped on thick gloves, gently pressing the trap's side springs. The metal groaned and the bobcat flinched, but didn't strike. One snap, one fluid motion. The leg was free. Isabel applied gauze, wrapped it in a clean bandage, and used her emergency sling to lift the limp creature across her shoulders. It was risky, but she couldn't leave it here. She looked to Ranger, alert, ready. Then she glanced at the kitten. It was watching her. And when she stood up and turned toward the cabin, it followed, trail of shadows. The return hike to the cabin felt longer. The weight of the adult bobcat pressed into Isabel's shoulders, a living burden that shifted with each step. She adjusted the emergency sling, careful not to jostle the injured limb. Ranger moved ahead, cutting through brush, his instincts sharp and vigilant. And just behind her, the kitten trotted in determined silence, never straying more than a few feet away. The forest felt different now, heavier, more aware, as if it knew something sacred was in motion. The early afternoon sun dipped behind a curtain of gray clouds, casting the woods into a dusky shadow. Isabel's breaths came out in puffs, misty and fast. Her muscles ached, but she didn't slow down. Not with the bobcat's shallow breaths whispering against her back. Not with the memory of that blood-stained trap etched behind her eyes. Illegal steel jaw traps weren't uncommon in rural Montana, but they were banned for a reason. No licensed conservationist used them. Not anymore. It was cruelty wrapped in rust. Someone had set it here deliberately, far from public trails, and someone would have to answer for it. But first, save the cat. By the time they reached the cabin, snow had begun to fall, light, feathered flakes that clung to her hat and lashes. She pushed through the door, warmth rushing to meet her from the wood stove still burning from that morning. Inside, it smelled of pine, old books, and the faint sweetness of dried apple from a forgotten bowl on the counter. She laid the mother bobcat down gently on a padded mat in the corner of the room, just beside the fireplace. The cat stirred, but didn't resist. Her breaths were shallow but not failing. The bleeding had slowed. Ranger paced near the window, occasionally glancing toward the kitten, who had hesitated at the threshold of the open door. Wild instinct tugged at its paws. But something stronger, curiosity, maybe trust, won out. It stepped inside. Isabel knelt by the adult cat again and began cleaning the wound more thoroughly with iodine and sterile water. Every movement was measured, every glance a silent question. But the bobcat didn't growl, didn't snap, she just watched. "You're a fighter," Isabel whispered. "Your baby led me to you. Smart little thing." Guess that means you raised her right. She glanced at the kitten, now curled beside its mother. The bond between them was clear, and the miracle of it all was undeniable. Night had begun to settle when Isabel finished stitching the wound. It wasn't perfect. She wasn't a vet, but it would hold. She gently covered the leg with gauze again and tucked a blanket nearby, not over, just close enough for warmth. The kitten had fallen asleep with its head resting on its mother's flank. She made herself tea and stood at the cabin window, watching the snow deepen beneath the pine trees. Her radio crackled uselessly on the counter. She'd need to hike into town in the morning to report the trap, maybe find someone to transport the bobcat to a wildlife rehab center if she stabilized overnight. A knock would have startled her less than what happened next. The mother bobcat stirred, then slowly, painfully, lifted her head. Her eyes scanned the room until they found Isabel again, and then she made a soft, breathy sound. Not a growl, not a warning, just acknowledgement. Then, as if satisfied, she lowered her head back onto the mat. The next morning dawned with a sky the color of steel. A thin blanket of snow covered the forest floor, and clouds hung heavy, threatening more. Isabel checked the bobcat first. Still breathing, still warm, her pulse steady. The kitten stretched beside her, tail flicking, like it had slept in a sunbeam, rather than beside a smoldering fire. As she was preparing to leave for town, footsteps crunched on the snow outside. Her heart jumped. No one came out this way, ever. She reached for the hatchet near the door, not out of fear, but reflex. A moment later, the knock came. 3 sharp raps. She opened the door to find Carl Donnelly, a grizzled man in his 60s, his coat dusted with snow and his brow furrowed into a permanent scowl. Carl owned the ranch a few miles west and had been a thorn in her father's side for years over land boundaries and predator complaints. Carl's eyes narrowed as he peeked past her shoulder. Saw prints leading up here? Bobcat. You tracking it? I'm helping it, Isabel replied calmly. It was trapped. He sniffed. Trap yours? Her stare hardened. Of course not. Just making sure. Bobcats are dangerous, even sick ones. You shouldn't be bringing them into your cabin like pets. It's not a pet, she said, keeping her voice low. It's a wounded animal, Carl, and it was dying. That trap was illegal. Carl took a step forward, the tone in his voice shifting. Illegal traps happen. What doesn't happen is some overeducated girl turning her cabin into a sanctuary. You've got a dog. You let that cat stay. You're asking for trouble. Ranger let out a low growl from inside. Isabel didn't move. Thanks for your concern, she said coolly. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have to make a report. Carl's eyes flicked to the side of the cabin, where the paw prints led back into the trees. Suit yourself, he said, backing up slowly. But don't come crying if that thing turns on you. Wild always does. Then he left. And Isabel exhaled. Later that afternoon, she stood by the fireplace, gently offering the kitten a shallow bowl of warm milk. It sniffed, hesitant, then drank, tiny, trembling laps. The mother bobcat, now more alert, watched everything, every movement, but she didn't protest. She knew, she understood. And for the first time in weeks, Isabel felt something stir beneath the grief she carried. Purpose. Real, living purpose. Companions and conflict. By the 3rd day, the cabin felt transformed. What had once been a quiet retreat of solitude had become something else entirely. A refuge. The bobcat mother had grown stronger, though she still limped heavily when she tried to stand. Isabel kept her movement slow and predictable, speaking softly whenever she approached, making no sudden gestures. The kitten, on the other hand, had adapted quickly. It followed Isabel from room to room, tail up like a tiny sentinel, always checking back on its mother. And perhaps most remarkable of all, Ranger accepted it. At first, The collie had been wary. His eyes followed the kitten's every move, ears alert, body tense. Isabel had kept him tethered the first night, just in case, but it hadn't taken long. Something about the kitten's demeanor, the absence of fear, the way it sniffed Ranger with a strange, wild curiosity, seemed to break through. By day 2, they were sharing floor space near the fire. By day 3, the kitten was curled against Ranger's flank, purring softly, while Ranger napped with his nose resting on a paw. Isabel had never seen anything like it. She took notes obsessively in her field journal, drawing connections between predator-prey instincts and interspecies bonds, theorizing on early social imprinting and shared trauma as factors for their behavior. But underneath the science, her heart simply felt full. Still, outside the cabin, the world remained as harsh as ever. When she returned from town that afternoon, supplies packed in her canvas bag, a receipt from the ranger station tucked in her coat, she found Carl Donnelly parked in her driveway, leaning against his rusted Ford, like he owned the ground beneath it. "You report me?" The words were sharp, cold. Isabel closed the door of her truck carefully. "I didn't name names. I reported a trap found on protected forest land. That's all." Carl's mouth tightened. "Well, damn convenient timing. My traps go missing, and now there's a wounded cat holed up in your place." Her jaw clenched. "It was almost dead, Carl. That trap was illegal. So is harboring a wild predator without a license. It's temporary." "That's not how laws work, little lady." Isabel stepped closer, chin up. "You want to talk legality, Carl? Let's talk about using steel jaw traps on federal land. Let's talk about how a kid could have stepped in that. Or how that mother bobcat would have died, leaving her kitten to starve alone in the snow." Carl's face reddened. He stepped forward, too close. "You think that thing's grateful? You think it won't claw you open the second it gets hungry?" Before she could respond, a low growl erupted behind her. Ranger stood in the cabin doorway, hackles raised, lips curled. Carl didn't back down, but he didn't move closer either. "I'll be reporting this to Fish and Game," he muttered. "You'll lose your permits, maybe your job." Isabel didn't flinch. "Do what you have to." Carl spit into the snow and climbed back into his truck, the tires spinning gravel as he tore away. That night, Isabel sat at the hearth with Ranger's head in her lap and the fire cracking beside them. The kitten slept on a folded towel near the fire, tail curled over its nose. The mother bobcat had shifted into a half-sitting position, eyes on the window, always watching. "Some people," Isabel whispered, stroking Ranger's ears, "only see threats, no matter what's in front of them." She looked at the wild pair across the room. "But some of us, we see a chance." She didn't sleep that night. Not really. Her thoughts spun with anxiety over what Carl might do. Fish and Game wouldn't show up overnight, but the storm was building. She'd seen it before. Complaints turned into citations, then into shutdowns. Her research program was still under probationary review, and her field permit could be revoked at the first sign of irregular behavior. And yet, she couldn't bring herself to regret it. When the bobcat had let her remove that trap, when the kitten had curled against her coat the night before, something had changed, not just in the animals, in her. She wasn't filling time anymore. She was living it. The next morning brought frost and tension. As she stepped outside to split firewood, she saw footprints. Not Carl's, smaller, more than one set. Snow partially covered them, but it was clear. Someone else had been near the cabin. She called in the tracks to the ranger station, disguising concern as routine wildlife logging. Her voice was steady, but her stomach nodded. Poachers. Hikers. She couldn't afford surprises right now. Back inside, the bobcat was on her feet, barely, but she was moving, limping from mat to window, testing the leg. The kitten danced beside her like a shadow. Ranger gave a quiet bark and wagged his tail. "Yeah," Isabel said softly. "She's ready to go." It hit her harder than expected. She had saved them, but they didn't belong to her. They belonged to the forest. The bobcat glanced toward the door, then back at Isabel. For a moment, the wild held its breath. Then, the bobcat turned toward her kitten and, with a grunt, padded to the threshold. Isabel opened the door wide. The forest waited, and slowly, carefully, the bobcats walked out into the snow. Not with fear, with grace. And as they disappeared between the trees, the only sound was the soft crunch of their paws, and Ranger's whine at her side. Isabel knelt and pressed a hand to his neck. "We did good," she whispered. "They'll remember." Blizzard warning. The warning came through the old radio, its signal crackling like dry leaves underfoot. Severe winter storm incoming, expected to hit Bitterroot Valley by nightfall. All residents advised to shelter in place. Avoid travel. High winds and whiteout conditions possible. Isabel stood still, the message repeating in its scratchy loop as she stared out the window. Snow was already falling harder, dancing like ash across the porch steps. The temperature had dropped rapidly. Her breath now hung in the air inside the cabin like a ghost. She moved quickly. Firewood. She brought in an extra 3 armloads and stacked them neatly near the hearth. Water. She filled every pot and jug in the house. Batteries, lanterns, dog food for Ranger. She checked each supply twice. Survival here wasn't theoretical. The nearest help was a Ranger outpost 12 miles away, and even then, only reachable if the roads held. Outside, the pines swayed in the gusting wind, creaking like old bones. Ranger paced beside the door, restless. He sensed it, too. She took stock of the clearing. No fresh tracks, no signs of the bobcats. It had been 2 days since they returned to the forest. She hadn't seen them since. But she thought of them constantly, especially the kitten, how it had nestled beneath her jacket that night, trusting her with more than its life, trusting her with its wild heart. A sharp knock at the door startled her. She opened it to find Willa Donnelly, Carl's 14-year-old granddaughter, bundled in an oversized coat, her face blotched with panic. "Ranger!" she gasped, catching her breath. "It's Jackson! He's missing! My little brother!" Isabel's stomach dropped. "When?" "An hour ago, we were hiking. He saw something in the trees and chased it. I thought he'd come back, but he didn't." "Did you tell Carl?" Willa shook her head. "He's at the logging site. No service. Please, can you help? I didn't know where else to go." Isabel didn't hesitate. She pulled on her thickest coat, grabbed her pack and emergency beacon, and clipped Ranger's lead to his harness. The snow was already knee-deep in places, and the wind howled like something alive. As they stepped off the porch, the cold bit into her skin, but the fear in Willa's eyes burned hotter. Isabel didn't know where to look, but someone did. Just beyond the tree line, barely visible against the swirl of white, a shadow moved, low, deliberate. The kitten. It stared at her, then turned toward the woods and paused, waiting. Isabel looked down at Ranger. He was locked in, alert, no barking, no hesitation. She met Willa's eyes. "Stay close," she said. Then, without a word, they followed the Bobcat Kitten into the blizzard. A wild hero emerges. Snow whipped through the air in violent gusts, erasing the trail behind them, almost as fast as it formed. Isabel shielded her eyes, crouched low, as they trudged through drifts, nearly up to their thighs. Ranger stayed glued to her side, his fur matted with ice, his nose to the wind. And just ahead of them, the kitten. It darted through the snow like a ghost, pausing often, always looking back to make sure they were still coming. Isabel couldn't understand how it was surviving this storm, let alone navigating it, but she didn't question it. Every direction in the woods now looked the same. Trees bowed under heavy snow. The horizon had vanished. Without the kitten, they would already be lost. They'd gone nearly a mile when Ranger suddenly stopped. He barked a sharp, single warning and bolted ahead. The kitten vanished into the trees. "Ranger!" Isabel called. But then she heard it. A faint voice, muffled, crying. Willa clutched her arm. "Jackson!" They sprinted after Ranger, their boots sinking into the powder with every step. Through a tangle of fir trees and broken branches, they found him. A small form in a red coat, huddled at the base of a fallen pine. Snow had begun to pile over him. His leg was pinned under a thick limb, and his face was pale, lips trembling. "Jackson!" Willa dropped beside him, wrapping her arms around his shoulders. Isabel fell to her knees. "Don't move him yet," she said, brushing snow away from the boy's face. "We'll get that tree off you." Ranger circled the boy, whining, licking his hands. Together, Isabel and Willa dug around the branch. It wasn't huge, but it was frozen in place. Isabel braced herself and heaved, heart racing, lungs burning. The branch shifted just enough. She pulled Jackson free and wrapped him in her coat. His teeth chattered. "I heard a cat," he mumbled. "I followed it." Isabel froze. Willa met her eyes, stunned. "It wasn't a cat," Isabel whispered. "It was a bobcat. She led you here." From the shadows behind them, a soft rustle. The kitten stepped into view again, snow dusted across its whiskers, eyes glowing in the half-light. Jackson stared, wide-eyed. "That's it. That's the one I saw." The kitten looked once at Isabel, then at Ranger, then disappeared back into the trees without a sound. Ranger barked once, then turned in the direction of the cabin. "Time to go," Isabel said, hoisting Jackson into her arms. The hike back was slower, harder, but the wind began to ease, and in the clearing above, for the first time all day, a sliver of sky appeared through the storm. Letting go, holding on. The cabin glowed in the soft amber light of dusk, its windows fogged from the heat within. Isabel had wrapped Jackson in wool blankets, propped him by the fire with a mug of warm cider, while Willa sat close by, brushing wet hair from her brother's forehead. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving behind a hushed, glistening world of snow-covered silence. Isabel stood at the window, her hands wrapped around a mug, eyes fixed on the tree line. She was waiting, and she knew what for. They had returned. She could feel it, even before she saw the movement. A small rustle, then a flicker of tan against white. The bobcat kitten emerged slowly, cautiously into the clearing just beyond the porch. It was alone this time, sitting perfectly still on a low drift, watching the cabin with those same alert, impossible eyes. It didn't need anything. It didn't want food. It had simply come to say goodbye. Isabel stepped outside without a coat, feeling the cold wrap around her like a sheet of clarity. She didn't speak, didn't move closer. She didn't need to. The kitten blinked once, then turned and melted back into the trees, as silent and graceful as it had come into her life. Ranger stood beside her, tail down, posture calm. He watched the forest a moment longer before turning back toward the warmth inside. "Will we see it again?" Willa asked, appearing at the door, a blanket around her shoulders. Isabel smiled softly. "If we're lucky, but maybe not." "That's okay," Willa said. "It already did what it came to do." Isabel nodded, the weight of those words sinking deep. Yes, it had. Later that night, she sat on the floor beside Ranger, who lay sleeping after the long day. The cabin felt still again, but not empty. She opened her journal and began to write. Subject: unidentified female bobcat. Estimated age 3 months upon first contact. Behavior: highly socialized. Demonstrates cognitive direction, interspecies cooperation, advanced emotional responsiveness. She paused, pen hovering above the paper. Then she added, beneath all the data, She taught me that connection isn't always domesticated. Sometimes it's wild. Sometimes it walks away and still leaves something behind. Her fingers lingered on that sentence. Then she closed the journal and leaned back against the wall, eyes on the dark window where forest shadows flickered against the glass. She didn't feel alone anymore. Legacy of a silent friendship. Spring came late to Bitterroot Valley that year. When the thaw finally reached the ridges and the ice gave way to rushing creek water, the forest awoke with color. Green moss crept back over stones. Birds returned to their perches. And in town, the story of the storm spread like fire through dry brush. The bobcat that led a woman and her dog into a blizzard. The boy they pulled from the snow just in time. And the wild that had not harmed but helped. Carl Donnelly never officially apologized. But a week after the rescue, Isabel found a hand-carved wooden sign left outside her cabin. Burned into the grain were the words, "Bitterroot doesn't forget." She never saw Carl again, but she saw change. Willa became a regular visitor, asking endless questions about bobcats, about Ranger, about how to read tracks in the snow. Isabel taught her to map the stars, to sit still and listen when the forest wanted to speak. The cabin, once a place of isolation, grew into something else, a center of learning, a place where children from the nearby schools came for weekend trips, where retired rangers dropped by with old stories and hot coffee. Isabel began a formal wildlife education program, offering field experience to students and nature lovers alike. And at the center of it all was the story of the kitten. No name, no collar, no photograph ever caught it clearly. But it lived on, in drawings, in murals, in the whispers of kids playing near the tree line. "She'll come back," they'd say. "If you're kind, if you're quiet." Isabel never promised them she would, but sometimes on early mornings when the frost still clung to the edges of the cabin windows, she'd spot a trail, tiny paw prints in the mud, always just outside the clearing, never crossing the porch. The wild, she had learned, doesn't return to be tamed. But it remembers. It watches. It chooses. One year after the storm, the town painted a mural on the side of the Bitterroot Conservation Center. It showed a woman, her border collie, a boy wrapped in blankets, and a bobcat kitten standing at the edge of the forest, eyes like glowing embers. Below it, in bold brushstrokes, the inscription read, "Not all legends are myths. Some are just wild enough to be true." And inside the building, framed behind glass, sat Isabel's final field journal entry for that season. Short, simple. "The wild came to me, and I listened." In a world that often moves too fast to notice the quiet miracles, this story reminds us of a simple truth. Real connection doesn't always speak our language. Sometimes it arrives on silent paws, leads us through a storm, and disappears before we can say goodbye, leaving behind something far more powerful than words. Isabel didn't seek out a legend. She followed a moment of instinct, chose compassion over fear, and in doing so, discovered not just a bond with a wild creature, but a part of herself that had been missing. The kitten, the storm, the rescue, they weren't just events. They were mirrors of what happens when we listen, really listen, to the world around us. At Paw Prints and Stories, we believe the wild is not just out there in the forests. It lives within us, in our instincts to protect, to love, and to do the right thing, even when it's not easy. So here's your challenge. In your own life, will you choose to follow the trail when it appears, even if it leads somewhere uncertain? Subscribe to Paw Prints and Stories if you believe every creature has a story worth telling.